all across America and around the world. This is Veterans Radio. This is Veterans Radio.
Welcome to Veterans Radio. I am Jim Fausone. I'm the officer of the deck today. We've got some great programs for you. I think you'll find very interesting. We always want to remind you can find more about Veterans Radio at its Facebook site or by going to veteransradio.net, where we're on the web 24/7. You can find a lot of our podcasts there as well. We post new ones every Tuesday, so you can get a new story, a new interview, something you didn't know before by going to veteransradio.net. And before we get started, we want to thank our sponsors. First up, we want to thank National Veteran Business Development Council, nvbdc.org. It was established to certify both service-disabled and veteran-owned businesses. You'll find out how they can help your business by going to nvbdc.org. We want to thank Legal Help for Veterans. Legal Help for Veterans fights for veterans' disability rights all across the nation. You can reach them at 800-693-4800 or on the web at legalhelpforveterans.com. We also want to thank our latest national sponsor, Veteran Lending Council. It is a community dedicated to educating lenders, realtors, and veterans on the VA Home Loan Benefit Program. You can check them out on Facebook and other social media outlets. We want to welcome to Veterans Radio today John Faunce, Lieutenant Colonel retired from the United States Army, spent 20 years serving his country and recently retired. So we're going to talk about some things in the news. But John, welcome to Veterans Radio.
Jim, thank you so much. I'm just thrilled to be here.
Well, we've got some mutual friends, and they said great things about you, so I'm looking forward to learning about your career and your background. But I understand you went to high school here locally at Catholic Central and then moved on to West Point. What made you go to West Point?
I think the most immediate answer was my brother also had been there. He was a 1989 graduate. And so it was always in the back of my mind that I would consider perhaps going there. But also just my family has been a very veteran service-oriented family. My dad had 4 brothers. They all served in the military. My mom had 3 brothers. They all served in the military. I had one uncle who served in World War II, one in the Korean War, and one in Vietnam. And so it was just something that my parents were exposed to and they thought was a very high and noble calling. And I saw how my family reacted to my brother's service. He served during the Desert Storm, and we decorated the house. We watched the news, and we paid close attention to it. And it was a great party when he came home. And he always spoke highly of it, the Army as well as West Point. And he, like everybody else, said, it's really hard, it's really challenging. And I think I've always just been kind of drawn to anyone who likes to throw out a challenge or a level of difficulty. I just like to take it on.
Well, you never thought about going to the Naval Academy?
What academy? I've never heard of this.
Well, it's a long family service to the Army that the Faunce family has, and that's wonderful. It's really amazing, and probably when you went in, you didn't expect to spend 20 years, I don't think.
I did not expect to spend that long. I remember even thinking hard about, 5 years was as it's still the requirement once you graduate. I thought that's kind of long. I guess I didn't think 20 was long.
Well, and I don't believe, was your brother a career service member?
No, he got out at his 5-year mark and moved on.
Well, again, it's one of those things. You get these great jobs, you get these great people you work with on important issues, and 1 year rolls into the next, and you look up and say, Hey, I really enjoyed the 20. But let's go back. Tell us a little bit more about your career in the infantry and ultimately into special forces and on to some other places after that. So give us the thumbnail sketch of this.
Certainly. Well, I graduated and was commissioned on the 2nd of June, 2021. So 21 years ago today.
There you go. Yeah, nice coincidence.
And of course, the world changed greatly a few months later in September. And so I was in the infantry officer captain's career basic course when that happened down at Fort Benning, Georgia. And things got, very interesting very quickly. I finished that up and graduated and went on to Ranger School, and then immediately reported to Fort Bragg, North Carolina in the summer of 2002. And we immediately saw shortly after tensions building in the Middle East. And as war loomed in January, we got orders to go to Iraq as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom. And so I spent 8 months as a rifle platoon leader during my time there in Iraq, spending most of my time there in Baghdad, really as a 23-year-old kid trying to learn every day what I needed to be doing. It was a very daunting task for a young infantryman at the time. But, my platoon of 40 guys, we were all kind of doing it together.
Well, and that's what I want you to talk a little bit about that, because, you're freshly minted out of the West Point. You're all of a sudden in charge of 40 men, and not just, making widgets on the line. This is life and death stuff. So one of the things the military really gives you is this early exposure to leadership, doesn't it?
Yes. It starts very early on. You're responsible for everything you do as a young cadet. And when you get further on at West Point, and I would later go back as a TAC officer doing the same thing to other cadets, they try to put the onus of decisions on you and let you make it, as a leadership laboratory should be. And so you get used to making those decisions, and you get used to making some bad decisions, and you get used to learning how to rebound or become a little bit more resilient toward those decisions. You're going to make bad ones. That's what things like Ranger School and the basic course are for. They're going to put you in situations where you're going to have to lose something no matter what decision you make. There is no perfect answer in these scenarios, because in those kind of situations, you got to sometimes have to figure out amongst all the chaos, how to get out of the situation or how to get out of this environment as best you can. And I think everyone knew that, and everyone knew that there was a lot on my shoulders as well as theirs. And I think it fostered a lot of open communication. We were light infantry, but you really couldn't do that in Baghdad in order to cover down on our sector. So all of a sudden now we have vehicles, and we hadn't really even trained for that. I mean, the vehicles were just things that took us to the forest so they could drop us off before it started raining. And here we are trying to figure out new SOPs, new ways and TTPs to operate as a light infantry unit with vehicles inside an urban environment. And so I think just the openness that everyone had about we've got to put our heads together to figure out the best way to do this really built some trust amongst us and my squad leaders. And it was a daily occurrence. We sat down every day and just looked at ourselves and say, hey, how we doing? We're doing good? All right. Anyone think we should be doing something different? And it led to some good conversations.
Well, you had multiple overseas assignments. So you were in Iraq, and I think it was 2003 and 4 overlapping. Tell us the other two that you had.
There was a second deployment to Iraq during their first elections, which was a very interesting time to be there, to see them go out and vote for the first time to set their destiny. I also then would transition over to the Special Forces in 2005 and went to 3rd Special Forces Group out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina as well. And we did a trip to Tajikistan, training their border guards. They share a border with Afghanistan, and the opium was being transmitted between those borders pretty porously. So we were training up those individuals. We had 534 Tajiks with us, and just teaching them some border patrol maneuvers. And then 2009, my detachment, my Special Forces 12-man detachment, went to RC East and partnered with the Afghan Commandos. There was only 6 Afghan commando units in the entire country, and we were fortunate to get one of those. And they were tapped for the better training, better pay, and the more hazardous duties and missions. So we did operations all throughout RC East, which is the entire eastern side of Afghanistan. Pretty good.
John, for those who might not understand what Special Forces means in the Army, can you give them an explanation here for Veterans Radio?
Sure. So the United States Special Forces is the only unit authorized by Congress to conduct unconventional warfare. And we focus there a little bit on building up other nations. And what we were doing in Iraq and Afghanistan is what we call FID, which is Foreign Internal Defense. A Special Forces team is a 12-man self-sustaining team with highly skilled people in weapons, engineering, medical, and communication specialists, as well as intel specialists and some planning specialists like myself. And doctrinally, we're supposed to be able to train up to a battalion-sized level, which is why we had so many Tajiks and why I had an entire battalion of Afghans. And our job really is to work ourselves out of a job, as we say. We try to train them up to do their own planning, train them up to do their own rehearsals, equipment maintenance, logistics, and hopefully as we continue to build them up, we can take a lesser role back. That's our goal. We try not to be the face of the operation. We really try to push them forward and keep them in front. And it takes some specialized training to have that kind of patience, because sometimes you want to do things yourself because it might be the easiest way to do it. But a Special Forces team is going to build up over time those skills inside that unit so that they can walk away one day and no longer be needed, hopefully.
Well, and this fits into a little bit of what your areas of study were. At West Point, you obtained a degree in psychology, and you also graduated from Columbia University with a master's in organizational psychology in 2011. So this whole thinking about it and how to motivate people and organizationally and the psychology of all of that was sort of fit right into your role in these assignments, I would think.
Yes. In fact, it was President Eisenhower who was instrumental in bringing psychology and a few other disciplines to United States Military Academy when they were not existing. And I think he, of course, understood greatly the impact that leaders can have just by their presence and just by understanding who you're leading. The emotional intelligence perhaps was not necessarily always a well-defined term early on in those days, but he did a lot to push that. And now all the TAC officers that go to help train these 4,000 cadets at the United States Military Academy get that degree in organizational psychology through Columbia. They have a wonderful partnership and huge support. But that's because the entire goal was to help these individuals, again, make their decisions on their own and take ownership of those decisions. But each decision affects people so much differently that you've got to kind of have that flexibility and patience to understand that you're dealing with a different person and trying to meet them at their level of how they understand it, and to push them and find where they don't understand themselves, but to give them the support to go ahead and make those decisions and learn from them.
Well, I think many of us have an engineering undergrad, see things too black and white, 2 + 2 = 4. But it's when dealing with human beings, it's often not quite so regimented and black and white. So I can really see how this fits into being able to work with so many different types of people all around the country. And you had an interesting, we could talk all day on that subject alone, but I want to move along to something that you had an interesting opportunity to work on in your last 4 years with the Army. And as you said, you just retired, so this is all pretty fresh stuff. And you were assigned to NATO, and talk to us about the role that you were in at NATO and sort of what you've learned about its role in Europe and some of the things in the news today about Ukraine.
Certainly. We were getting near the end of our career, and my wife had studied abroad in college and really wanted to go to Europe. And so I looked at a few bases. And this NATO Special Operations Headquarters in Mons, Belgium, it's a small place, not well known, only really been around since 2010. And so we saw the opportunity to work with many different nations and live amongst many different nations as probably the greatest opportunity we could find. And when we speak about psychology, again, just even when it comes down to cultural differences, you've got to be in tune to that as well, not just in amongst Americans, but in amongst different nationalities. And it is different from Western Europe to Eastern Europe in terms of, personal space or, hierarchy and things like that. And so we went there and I got into the exercise planning realm. And I thought that was going to be interesting because I got to travel around and also do some actual exercises and actually get really active in some of these nations and help build them up. And then my last 2 years, I was the director of the exercises and then also took on evaluations and assessments. I had an office only of about 11 people, but a Turk, a Spaniard, a Brit, a Hungarian, an Italian, a Romanian, and a Lithuanian, and a Pole. And it was really cool. And we sit there and we put our heads together and try to figure out, how to make a plan for this nation to exercise themselves, figure out their training objectives, and meet those things and become interoperable with NATO standards. That was basically what our office did. You have a lot of nations that can do things according to their own standards, and if we want to have a NATO mission together, we've got to have some common standards, some common vernacular, and some common systems. And so that was what we were doing. So every year we were training up a different nation to be the response force. And the NATO response force is that in the event of an Article 5, which is the article that says an attack on one is an attack on all, were to be voted on, there's got to be some nation ready to go, 10 days notice to move. And that's what we were training up each year, testing their systems, testing their procedures. And then different nations would provide battalion level units to this force. It wouldn't just be that nation. While I was there, Poland was one of the nations, and they were the framework nation, meaning in terms of special operations, if they were needed, Poland would be the headquarters. It would be a Pole in charge of all of the special operations. And they get units from all the different countries. And they had been a big, big sponsor of Ukraine. And so in 2019, Ukraine came forward and said, hey, we want to put forward a battalion for the NATO response force. And as far as I know, it made a lot of people kind of scratch their heads asking, like, well, do they have to be part of NATO to be part of the response force? And the answer really was no. And so they absolutely could be part of the NATO response force. So they put in a formal offer of about 2,000 individuals to be evaluated along NATO standards. And so we started making a few trips to Brovary near Kiev and working with the Ukrainian Special Operations Command. And it was great. You could see that for this, it was a big deal. It was a big deal for them. They've had some history of trying to join the EU, putting their feelers out to see about NATO, and it's been a tough time for them in some regards, especially in 2014 when they missed joining the EU, and then shortly after in 2015 when they lost Crimea as well. And so this was serious business for them, and they took it extremely seriously. And they brought us out, they sat us down, they had what we would definitely call, from an American standpoint, austere conditions and rudimentary equipment, but their will was unparalleled to get it right. The stakes, I think, were higher for them than perhaps some of us that were enjoying being in NATO, because even though they were part of the response force, they were not part of the alliance.
John, could you talk about the, we view our military, particularly the officers and the NCOs, as a real professional corps. Can you comment about the professionalism and the degree of education and training that you saw among both NATO countries, but also somebody like Ukraine?
Sure. Yes, there are stark differences, and it's hard to generalize without perhaps making someone say, hey, you're forgetting about me. But in general, Western Europe has seen some longer years of development of their militaries, whereas the Eastern European, just their boundaries and their geography has changed. Drastically. Starting from 1989, and then when Yugoslavia broke up. So some of these nations are quite new, and they don't have, like myself, who, my uncles and my grandfathers, we're in very professionalized armies, and we keep a lot of the same units, and we kept a lot of the same bases, and we've kept a lot of the same everything while also improving upon it and handing it down from generation to generation. You'll see a lot of times in the eastern side of Europe that there's still a Russian mentality. Some nations will recognize it. Some nations don't recognize it as much, in my opinion. But the Soviet mentality of how they outline, and in that history for them, officers are considered of a higher class and are considered, perhaps, they are less open to candid feedback, something that we will value excessively in the United States Army. Even former Secretary Bob Gates saying, hey, listen, your leaders, the greatest thing they need from you is your honest feedback, because they're trying to lead you, and that's what they're supposed to be doing. And if you don't tell them how you're doing, they're not going to be able to produce the product that they're supposed to be out there doing. In the eastern parts of Europe, I have found that it is a little bit more, a little bit less welcomed to question authority. That's definitely one takeaway I took. When it came to Ukraine, they had the same thing, but I think they also owned it, and they also kind of wanted to get away from it. When I went there, one of the first things they put up was an organizational chart of who's in their exercises branch. And just for one example, we looked at it, and part of it was a sniper. And, exercise branches, you're training exercises, and there might be an aspect where you got to train on a sniper, but why do you have the sniper in there? He can just be part of the unit. And they said, oh, well, that's an old Soviet line and block chart. Like every unit had to have a sniper. It was, something to be regarded as special to be the sniper. So we've kept it. And then we kind of sat there for a little while and asked a few more questions. And by the end, they're like, yeah, we probably need to get rid of that.
Yeah, we don't need that standalone block. Yeah.
Yeah, we probably don't need a separate guy who is focused on being a sniper, when our job is to, organize, resource, and execute training exercises. They're open to those kind of things, and they're all looking to move away from anything that they might attribute to an old Soviet mentality.
So you're in this job at NATO on exercises and training, and you've worked with Poland and you've worked with Ukraine, and you retire, and 2 months later all hell breaks loose, and Russia invades Ukraine. Were you, I guess, surprised, but as most people were, but maybe you foresaw something, and kind of B, what reaction did you have to how this started, and now 100 days later or something, how it's playing out?
Sure. I have to admit that I think I'm like a large majority of people, especially even those that were in my headquarters, that I did not think we would get to the point of invasion. And I said that if we did, it would just be a small land grab for some of the already identified areas as Russian separatists. That's really how I felt, and clearly it wasn't right. And I can't tell you the foggiest of why he has taken such a prolonged interest in trying to win this war with Ukraine. And so I was caught off guard. I know some people weren't. I'm sure there were some people that saw it coming. But we talk about in America, and like, hey, have an end game, a withdrawal plan in mind. And I don't think he had it. I think he thought it would be easier to get in and control the country. And the Ukrainians have proven to be pretty resilient, pretty staunch in their love of freedom and their desire to get out of this. And eventually they've mentioned they want to join NATO. And I don't think that's really the biggest problem that Russia was facing with Ukraine, but they, for whatever reason, decided that they were going to go in with this much force. And I think the initial stall we saw was not planned for. I don't think the troops were quite ready for it. You saw there was a corridor open, a humanitarian corridor open from Ukraine to Russia for those who wanted to come back to Russia. And everyone thought that was kind of crazy, but it's pretty established now in the open source intelligence that Russia had to do that just to resupply their forces because they were running so low on ammunition and gasoline because some of the troops didn't even know they were going to be going to war. They thought they were going to an exercise. They really bumbled it up.
As an Army guy in this NATO position on exercise and training, I'm just curious whether or not that also involved naval forces, because in Ukraine we've seen the fight has been focused on Mariupol and maybe Odessa, and maybe that's what they're really after, is that those naval ports. Does NATO have a naval component and exercise and work in that regards?
They do. NATO has a maritime component command out of Great Britain, and MARCOM, as they're called, takes part of these exercises as well. I was solely on the special operations side, but every time we did the NATO response force certification, I would end up being in Norway in a bunker and directing the special operations side of the training objectives. Right next to me would be a MARCOM guy directing the naval side of it. And we did exercises. Trident Javelin 17 was a heavy exercise in and around the Mediterranean Sea, and as well as the Baltic Sea in the exercise. So we rehearsed that, practiced that, get those protocols down for how a amphibious assault would go down, using special forces to potentially clear beachheads or neutralize targets on a potential landing site.
Fascinating to talk to somebody who was on the ground for NATO, looking at some of these issues and game planning exercises that certainly would have had a Red Army involved, maybe not called Russia, but conceptually. Do you have a prediction on how this ends?
I have a tough time making a prediction because my first prediction turned out to be wrong. So I don't want to go 0 for 2.
I hear you. It's fair enough. I don't think there are many commentators or military experts who at this point are comfortable predicting, because it's not gone the way anybody thought.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm willing to state my opinions, and knowing that there's just the best guess I can come up with listening and talking to others. If we're still going this late in the game, it's going to be a protracted time. It's going to be some time. If we continue to only support Ukraine through external means, which I think we will, and I think it's the right thing, because I think having Ukraine stand on their own right now is going to be more beneficial for them and for security in Europe in the long run than anything else. Because then it's going to tell those that might face trouble with Russia that, hey, we have seen what you are capable of and found wanting. And maybe it kind of reduces their ability to bully or ability to strong arm people into things. At the same time, we don't need to cut Russian people off from everything resource-wise. It's going to be a tough thing because it's really not between us and the Russian leadership. And for Vladimir Putin, between him and his oligarchs, they're going to have to figure some things out. The dangerous course of action really is if he thinks that this is the only way to save face is to continue on. What is he willing to do in order to make sure that he at least saves some face? My hope would be that the best we could perhaps get out of this, if we don't want to involve ourselves further, is to take some of the areas that are Russian separatist areas, concede them, and then draw those lines, and then enter Ukraine into NATO with those new lines. It would be tough. For a Ukrainian, they'd probably hate to hear me say that. They really would. But again, just like when we say, when you're as a cadet trying to figure out, hey, you got a choice to make here in the woods. And by the way, you're not going to get out of here probably with some casualties. What's the path of least, danger for you to take?
Yeah, there's no good decision, as you say.
No, there's no 100% solution here. So we got to figure out if we don't know what they're after, if we're not really sure. I'm sure some people have some great ideas. We've got to figure out what we can hand them now to get this done and get this over. So there's bloodshed that stops, resources start going back and flowing, and the average citizen is not suffering as much as they are, because every day it goes on for us, it's another news story. Every day it goes on for them, it might be another day without food, another day without petroleum or something like that. And so it become very dangerous in the long run.
Well, we appreciate Lieutenant Colonel John Faunce, retired from the Army, spending a little time talking to us about his military experience and most recently serving with NATO and what he saw in Poland's capabilities, and more importantly, maybe what he saw in the Ukraine capabilities of the military, having just retired out. And I want to thank everybody for listening to Veterans Radio today. I am Jim Fausone. It's been a pleasure to be your host. I'm a veterans disability lawyer at Legal Help for Veterans, and you can reach us at 800-693-4800 or legalhelpforveterans.com on the web. You can follow Veterans Radio on Facebook and listen to its podcasts and internet radio shows by going to veteransradio.net. And until next time, you are dismissed.
If you have a VA claim denied by the Board of Veterans' Appeals, contact Legal Help for Veterans at 1-800-693-4800. They're experts in handling cases before the U.S. Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims. Their number again, 1-800-693-4800.
We again want to thank our national sponsors, the National Veterans Business Development Council, nvbdc.org, VA Ann Arbor Health Care System, the Vietnam Veterans of America Charles S. Kettles Chapter, Ann Arbor, Michigan, VFW Graf O'Hara Post 423 in Ann Arbor, and the American Legion Press Corn Post 46, also in Ann Arbor. And the Veterans Lending Council, which advises lenders, realtors, buyers about VA Home Loan Program, and you can find them on Facebook. We appreciate all your support. You can go to veteransradio.net, click on the sponsor level, and continue to support keeping Veterans Radio on the air. And until next time, you are dismissed.
It is Ryan here, and I have a question for you. What do you do when you win? Like, are you a fist pumper, a woohooer, a hand clapper, a high fiver? I kind of like the high five, but if you want to hone in on those winning moves, check out Chumba Casino. At ChumbaCasino.com, choose from hundreds of social casino-style games for your chance to redeem serious cash prizes. There are new game releases weekly, plus free daily bonuses, so don't wait. Start having the most fun ever at ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.